Welcome everybody to the DevOps Online Summit 2021. My name is Craig Pearson and I'm going to be the SRE track chair for the event. And I'm sitting here today with our speaker, Nataliya Remez, who will be sharing some insights and ideas on the subject of SRE implementing DevOps. So welcome, Nataliya. Great to have you here today. Would you mind starting by just giving us a bit more information about yourself and your journey so far with DevOps and SRE?
Sure. Thank you, Craig, for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here and thanks for having me this year. It's actually not my first year participating in DevOps Online Summit. I really like the discussions we had so far, and I really like the way you organize it, even though we all are now supposed to be in the remote setting for the conferences. Yeah, my name is Nataliya Remez. I'm currently working at a company called Zettel. I'm responsible for tech platforms at Zettel. I have a role of head of tech platforms. Also, Zettel as a company actually was a Swedish startup before, and our company mission was to help small and micro merchants to succeed in the world of giants. These days, however, we have a bit of internal joke about that. Actually, our mission now, we see it is as actually help small and micro merchants to survive, not even compete with the giants, so to speak. Yeah, I've been in this company for around 4 years so far. I joined initially in some other department, but then I, about 3 years ago, moved to the SRE and cloud area of Zettel, where we are responsible for pretty much everything, beginning from our cloud infrastructure, ending with our apps and design platform teams. Maybe a bit of my background in general. So I actually came as a from the field of software engineering. I have a master's degree in computer science. Initially started my career about 13 probably years ago. I even forgot myself. But around that time, as a software engineer, changed different competencies, mostly worked with the backend and actual infrastructure as well. And then moved slowly to some managerial positions. Now here I am. Sorry, I need to take over. Head of tech platforms. Yeah, so this is pretty much me.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Nataliya. Great to have you here today. SRE is obviously a very new and emerging capability for some organizations, but for others, it's been part of their DNA for some time. In particular, Google are always held up as being the inventors and original advocates for SRE. And they themselves talk about DevOps and SRE a lot. They've published quite a few videos and blog posts, and they do say that the two approaches are very much complementary to one another. I think they use the term class SRE implements DevOps. So is that something you would agree with based on your experience?
Yes, actually, it's a good point about that. It was originally invented, let's put it this way, as a term, SRE itself. But DevOps is actually, as a term, was invented much earlier. And it's still a bit surprising for me, for example, that it's not really clear what's the difference and are we really doing DevOps? Are we succeeding with doing DevOps? And what's the next thing? So I definitely think that DevOps is actually culture or a foundation of SRE as a discipline. And if you look at the definition from Google, which actually is quoted like class SRE implements DevOps, it's essentially saying that DevOps is something more abstract, or as I said, it's a culture which actually encourages collaboration and shared responsibility of your production environment. And I think that this was also coined and quoted by Martin Fowler back in the times, that DevOps is not about tools, it's not about specific competence, it's about culture in your organization. How do you work with your teams and collaboratively taking care of your production environments? When it comes to SRE, I think it's more of the discipline, as I said, and it's actually what happens when you try to apply software engineering practices for operational problems. It's not a new approach. It's just, I think that Google historically maybe coined it the better way, and also they have an internal culture built around SRE. I think also a lot of, the fact that they shared their books written on the topic of SRE, both actually SRE book and the workbook, which is giving you very practical advices how to introduce and implement some practices in order to enable SRE in your organization. I think it helped a lot to this discipline to be promoted across different industries. And I think this is still a very good source of practices. And how do you even start with it if your organization is ready for this discipline, and so on and so forth. So I still can highly recommend checking out that book, and I think it's even available for free on the website from Google.
Yeah, very much so. They've been very vocal with both the book and the practices that they've shared with many practitioners. You mentioned DevOps being about culture, and I totally buy into that. Now, one of the cultural aspects is about breaking down barriers between different departments or different silo parts of an organization, and trying to get more continuous flow of new features, new applications, new variants of products. Now, that focus on a culture of speed of delivery is great, but how do we balance that rate of change with the high levels of reliability that we as users and consumers expect? Google talk about error budgets as a way of doing that. Do you agree that's the only way, or what have you seen worked effectively to balance that flow of delivery with reliability?
Very good question, Craig. Thanks for asking. Here, actually, I would like to take a bit more time and explain how do I think of SRE, first of all, and in the first place by using the DevOps foundational principles here. So maybe some of you still remember there was a framework called CALMS introduced by Jess Humble, who is the co-author of the famous DevOps Handbook. I think it was published in 2016, but I still find it very relevant to the current challenges in the industry. And essentially, this framework is explaining how can you work with 5 different pillars as a framework in your organization. So they are called culture, automation, lean, measurement, and sharing. If you look at them closer, for example, culture is the culture of shared responsibility, which is pretty much what SRE is also about. Also, it talks about automation which in SRE practices, you can easily connect to the practice of minimizing toil or manual recurring tasks, which needs to be performed by human or by running some script. And then if you look at the lean, it's actually limiting work in progress, working in the small batches, pretty much lean product development. And then if you look at the measurement, it actually talks a lot about how do you measure your success. And it can be actually something which is known in SRE as an error budget, but also how can you implement SLOs as a metric inside the organization. And essentially it's saying in this CALMS framework that you need to measure everything, or you need to have a mechanism in place that you can have a full visibility into your production systems. And the last pillar is called sharing. This one is in my book, is very much connected to the principles of SRE. It's where you have a user-friendly communication and sharing collaboration between SRE and product teams in your organization, and you kind of have a shared ownership of the things you have in production. So long story short, I think this is still foundational principles for both DevOps and SRE. And again, if you look at the SRE, it's also famous seven principles, which was coined by Google in their famous book. They pretty much saying the same. It's just about how do you want to how do you want to start this journey, and if you already have this calms or like this typical like pillars from the calms framework in your organization.
Okay, I'm pleased you've introduced the calms pillars, because they definitely resonate in this SRE world. So just to delve a little bit deeper, some view SRE as doing more DevOps, but in production. So for example, doing more continuous delivery, continuous testing, and continuous monitoring in a production environment, and also introducing techniques like failure testing to simulate what would happen in an outage. How prevalent are you seeing organizations doing that? How often do we see testing being done more in production?
Okay, nice question. I actually think that first of all, well, when you have this kind of fear, right, of testing anything in your production environments, it's usually a sign of a lack of some failover strategies when it comes to your production systems. And if again, back to the SRE principles, I think there is one actually stating pretty much what you can do more of. It's called reducing cost of failure. It's stated like this as a principle, but essentially what does it mean? It's that you can implement some practices, for example, incident management process inside the organization. Also, you can think of the culture of postmortems as a particular example, and then you can actually also think of implementing some progressive rollout in your production environments. Well, what does it really mean? It can be different. You not necessarily need to follow any specific practice or the company, how they're doing this, because your environment is usually very unique. But usually you should start asking questions internally in your organization. For example, do you have documented procedure for production incidents? Or how do you learn from failure as an organization? Another question could be, do you have a rollback strategy even in place? Like what happened when you have a security breach or you have some incident on your production system? Like how do you quickly roll back your recent changes which might cause this incident? So this is pretty much how I would address this problem, and how I would be more like pretty much implement psychological safety for your teams to do any testing or experiments with your production environment.
Yeah, it's interesting, which takes me on to the S of the comms model, sharing. What you're describing there requires more familiarity, or what Google would call the wisdom of production. More individuals in the business knowing about production, how it works, what makes it tick, what happens when it fails. So how do you share that wisdom of production when quite often we are in heavily regulated environments where actually access to production is restricted as much as possible? So how do we share more wisdom of production?
Yeah, good question. I actually, based on, again, my experience, I think this is back to this postmortem culture. It's like whenever you have an incident or whenever you have some failed experiment, let's put it this way, you probably need to invest some time to properly investigate what was the root cause and what might be the different circumstances or different type of factors affecting this incident to happen. And the most important actually is to share it after the postmortem meeting to be for the organization to be able to learn. Also, usually some teams, as a result of it, have an action item of maybe creating some playbook around your incident, so that some other team, or let's say some other department in the future, if they face the same problem, they can easily find that playbook and actually see how can they prevent this problem from happening, or like how can they react sometimes if problem already happened. So I'd say use as much, document as much, and share as much. There is a plenty ways of doing this. I know that many companies using Atlassian Stack. They have a perfect template which you can reuse for postmortems. And like the nice thing about it, you can easily share it across the org. Also, I think that if in your organization you don't have that culture of sharing, or you have a rather culture of scapegoating, well, you probably need to, again, work on the foundational basis, and just implementing this as a part of your SRE principle will not help, unfortunately. So start with the culture first, and that it's okay to share and fail fast and learn fast, instead of just trying to fix everything by your own without sharing what you actually done.
So you mentioned culture change again there. So whether it's DevOps or SRE, that organizational culture change is at the heart. Okay, you did mention the term SLO earlier. So just for those unfamiliar with the term, service level objective, would you just like to explain the kind of service level objectives that you are seeing and why they're so important?
Good question. Well, first of all, the foundational principle around SLO from the SRE book, again, it's saying that you cannot actually afford your teams to support your organization with 100% availability metrics, because it simply cannot be achievable. And this is why you need to set some contracts pretty much internally between your internal customers, which in case of SRE teams are usually product teams or developers, and the SRE team. So what is actually achievable within your operational metrics? And based on that, you can count the percentage. Like, for example, it can be not 100%, but maybe 99.98% or something. It really depends on your contract with your internal customer. And of course, it also depends on the business criticality of the component you support as an SRE. And maybe last thing about it is that it needs to be visible. So it needs to be on some kind of dashboard or some shared tool that you and the product team can actually have access to 24/7. So in a way, I know it's sometimes also confused with SLA. But SLA is mostly, it's less, I would say it's less operational, and it's more contractual, and it's more for your external customers or the users of your service, external users. But SLO in this case, it's all about your internal services, their availability metrics, and what is that your SRE team or your SRE department, depends on the size of the company, can support your product teams with as a metric.
Fantastic. So lots of organizations are embracing DevOps and SRE. Some are using on-premise infrastructure, some are cloud native, some are in between the two. Does cloud make SRE easier, in your opinion?
Well, I would say it definitely does. However, you need to, I know, again, because of the difference in the businesses, for example, if you're operating in the highly regulated industries like fintech, you usually have some compliance reasons why you still need to keep your hybrid or environment. So not only fully going with the cloud, but sometimes you have to keep your data due to GDPR regulations in some local data center in the country because of this regulation. In that case, well, again, you can easily rely on some metrics which are provided from the cloud vendor. But at some point, you also need to take care of your on-premise environments, where it's obviously a bit trickier. And there, I think you need to be super focused on having some metrics in place, like SLOs or SLIs. And when it comes to cloud, well, my experience is telling me that the only thing which can be a bit tricky is that if you really use different cloud vendors as well within one organization. In that case, they usually have a bit different strategies of sharing their availability metrics. But in most of the cases, well, I think you can hugely rely on the cloud, and actually this will ideally offload your SRE teams of being, on call all the time, being 24/7 available, and focus rather on internal improvements or like modernizing your infrastructure stack instead of just taking care of availability and the metrics around it. So I would definitely say this should be one probably of the, let's say, like strategic factors affecting the organization to choose cloud environment or rely on cloud vendor environment.
Thank you. Now, I've got one final question, if I may, and it's around where you see SRE heading in the future, because so many have taken current SRE knowledge, experience, and best practice and started to apply it. But what do you see as the future for SRE?
Yeah, it's well, from again my experience and from my observations, we still need to do a lot of education. Especially, we will be surprised not only on the level of engineering or like technical, but also it requires a lot of education for senior management in your organization or the people who actually have a mandate to take certain decisions of the direction we're going overall. And I think this still needs to be very much clearly explained. If you're not technical, let's say, if you never work maybe with an infrastructure or as a department or like as a software engineer within this department, because this is essential for me in the start of any journey with any type of transformation, not only becoming SRE, is the fact that you need to understand why are you doing this change, and if you're trying to pretty much implement something better, and what would be the business outcome of this transformation. Otherwise, you can easily stuck in this, like, continuous transformation project with a lot of trainings, coaching, and everything in place, but without clear end goal. So I think it's essential first to explain it properly to the management, get buy-in from the management, and then continue with some practical steps, which might actually be some trainings, or maybe it's doing a book club together, reading together SRE book from Google or any other book on this topic. So I think this is pretty much how we should proceed if we want to spread the knowledge about SRE as a discipline further. And also, of course, I would really like to have some, maybe not the same as a framework, but still some checklists to be able to say, yes, well, this is our kind of roadmap on this journey towards SRE. And this is going to be small steps we're going to take. Beginning, for example, with an incident management process, the culture of postmortem, automation, and minimizing toil.
It's great that you share the business angle here, because so much of what we're trying to achieve with DevOps and SRE is about delivering business goals. A lot of people think it's just about technology and technical goals, but actually we are, through SLOs and SLAs, trying to use technology, I suppose, to keep business problems. So it's great that you draw out. Again, one final question, if I may, is how do we keep SRE front of mind in senior managers? How do we get senior people in an organization to prioritize reliability over new features? Because I see that as being a constant battle. How do we prioritize reliability over those shiny new features that product owners love?
Yes, that's a great question. I actually continuously think about it because it's obviously a challenge these days, because it's again considered, as you said, something more like technical or some new practice which is solely technical, which it isn't. But I think you need to start shifting slowly but surely, shifting mindset in your organization towards reliability being your key product feature, instead of treating it as some non-functional requirement or something that can be done later on, or it's not that important because, let's say, we're just doing an MVP stage. And this requires also a lot of explanations, especially to those roles in your teams who are responsible for prioritization for the team, which is usually, ideally it's shared by your team, but also usually have a role of product manager in all of this. So your product managers, even though they might not be that maybe technical into details, but they still need to be able to understand the benefits of having reliability as a part of our backlog, and that we need to continuously think about it as a practice, let's say, as we do with agile practices, like we keep thinking about quality as a part of our software delivery. The same way we need to treat reliability, I believe.
Yes, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of non-functional requirements. A lot of people think that reliability is simply wrapped up in those, but no, it has to become much more visual. I'll confess I got more into SRE because a lot of organizations had embraced DevOps, had embraced Agile, and there was basically one-way traffic of new features, and in a lot of cases, unreliable features. And reliability went from being a second-class citizen to actually what you described as being that number one goal. And I think that's one of the key messages is if you are operating, services, making promises to your users, then we really should be keeping those promises, shouldn't we?
Yes, for sure.
Thanks, Nataliya, for the lessons that you've shared with us today. Is there any other advice you would give anybody who is setting off down this SRE road, based on your experience? Looking back, what would you have done differently when you started to look at SRE?
Yes, I was thinking about it. Probably the best advice I can give as of now regarding this fairly new field of discipline is that don't try to copy paste the same approach other company took about this discipline. It's really depends on, first of all, the organizational structure you have at the moment, your architectural or infrastructure and production system state, and also how much of the sharing culture you have or you're willing to take, and also if you're willing to take the challenge of change management and introducing these things maybe sometimes from scratch. So don't focus only on the technical part of SRE as a discipline. Try to also think of this cultural shift as a part of the journey.
Okay, great stuff. Thanks again, Nataliya, for talking about DevOps and SRE. And thanks again for being a presenter in the SRE track at the DevOps Online Summit.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
My name is Craig Pearson. I've been your host today. Take care, everybody, and enjoy the event.